Jeff, you see the accessory dwelling unit slide?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening to visit with us and join the community listening session for accessory dwelling units. We're hosting several of these and just really are in kind of listening mode and want to hear what community members have to what your thoughts are about this project. And so in terms of what to expect, we earmarked an hour of time. We'd like to do just a brief presentation on the project, sort of why are we doing this and what's being proposed. And then we'd like to earmark most of the meeting for opportunities for you to share your thoughts about what you've seen and ask any questions. Lastly, if you Google Lafayette Listens, you'll find the city's engagement page, which is called Lafayette Listens. And within that, there's a subpage on accessory dwelling units, which is screenshotted there on the right. That does include some useful information about the project. It includes more of these listening sessions, as well as a link to directly book meetings with staff if you wanted to talk one-on-one virtually or over a cup of coffee or in the office. And so we look forward to the discussion tonight. So a little bit of background on the project. So why now? Expanding accessory dwelling units in Lafayette outside of where they're currently allowed, and we'll show you a map in just a minute, but that's the Old Town residential area. We first started thinking about this back in 2019. We are seeing some community support for it, though that effort was tabled due to the pandemic. And since then, City Council has shown some interest in picking this back up. Between 2019 and now, we had also adopted a refreshed community vision through the 2021 Legacy Lafayette Comprehensive Plan. And that has a lot of different policies around supporting accessory dwelling units, supporting housing diversity, and so on. And as implemented, what we're looking at would come into effect this summer. The project has three primary objectives, and so we will be looking at allowing accessory dwelling units to existing single-family homes under the existing standards for accessory structures. Hi, if you're just tuning in, we're just kind of going over some of the introduction to the project, and then we'll be spending most of the time hearing any comments that you have about it. And so again, three objectives to the project. The first is to allow accessory units to single-family homes, and this would be under the existing accessory structures. And so this would essentially be looking at areas outside of the Old Town residential area and allowing an additional use to those single-family properties, but not changing what can physically be built there. And so we'll get into that in just a moment. The second objective is to explore different types of ADUs. So currently we allow detached ADUs in the Old Town area, but we'll be looking at internal conversion ADUs and attached ADUs. And then lastly, we just started a process of rewriting our land use code or zoning regulations. And we would consider that will have a lot of community engagement, and we would consider additional changes possibly through that process. And so we're hoping to just create a foundation for folks interested in this topic through this process that can carry forward into that other project. So this map shown in red is the Old Town Residential Zone District. And so this is Baseline Road on the upper third of the page and Public Road along roughly the center. This zone district was created back in 2002. And so the goal of the zoning regulations here was to better match those regulations with the unique character of that area and to encourage compatible development. Those regulations about 20 years ago included a provision for detached ADUs. And so the city made minor tweaks here and there since then, but they've largely remained the same. And we've permitted at least 55 ADUs in the OTR district, and those are shown with the little house icon. So the current definition of ADUs, again, this is only for detached ADUs in the Old Town residential area, really has three main points. And those 3 points are that the ADU needs to be located on the same lot as the principal home. So in this case, a detached single-family home. It needs to be incidental or subordinate to that principal home, and it's excluded from the calculation of dwelling units per acre. So that just means when you're looking at a plot of land and determining the maximum amount of dwelling units that can be located there, ADUs are not a factor in that, just the primary home. So those are the three main points of the definition of detached ADUs in Lafayette. Those definitions are implemented through design parameters throughout the code, and those are the primary ones are shown here. We can, again, dive into any of these if you'd like. Some things just to point out is that in Old Town, the maximum height of accessory structures is 20 feet. So that accommodates the ADU above a garage. So elsewhere in the city, it's actually lower, and we'll show you that in a minute. Another key thing to point out in this list is the 750 square feet of maximum floor area. So one of the big differences between an ADU and a duplex is that there's a limitation to ADUs, and in this case, it's 750 square feet, whereas in a duplex, there is no limitation. The other piece just to note is that there is a parking space that is required for accessory dwelling units. So onto the project approach. So this is a pretty narrowly focused project that we're looking to do this year. And there's really 3 points to this that we'll just hit in order here. So the first point of the proposal is expanding beyond the Old Town Residential Zone District. So this orange area is the Old Town Residential Zone District that you saw on the previous map. And that's where detached ADUs are currently allowed. So what this would do, it would expand the allowance of ADUs to most districts that allow single-family dwellings. And so at a minimum, we'd expect this to include the agriculture district, rural estate, low-density residential, medium-density residential, single-family and two-family residential districts, which are all shown here. There's some limitations that'll come into play that'll limit this a bit more in reality. And so we'll go over those in just a moment, but that's really the first point of the proposal is allowing that use outside of Old Town. The second point of the proposal is to allow different types of ADUs. And so we'll go through those now. The first type would be detached, and these are already allowed in Old Town. They're generally placed behind or set back from a main home. And they can be combined with another structure, like on top of a garage, like you see in Old Town. You see in the second two photos here. One thing you'll notice is that oftentimes these work really well when there's alley access, and so that's typical of what you see here in Lafayette so far. The second type that we would like to explore is interior ADUs, and so these would be interior conversions that include separate access through a main home or from an exterior staircase. And so the first two photos show a second-story ADU. Actually, the first three do. And then there's also opportunities for lower-level conversions, repurposing a basement, as shown in the photo on the far right. And then the third type is attached. And so these are fairly straightforward, and this involves basically the ADU being connected to the existing home on the property, usually through the construction of an addition to the side or the rear of the property. And again, all of these, especially the addition and detached, would need to meet whatever kinds of setbacks, height requirements, and all the other requirements that are currently in the code. And so we're not proposing to change any of those. And again, I guess I kind of got a little ahead of myself. The third point of the proposal is to allow them under the existing rules. And so there'd be kind of a checklist of things that a property would need to meet in order to be eligible for an ADU. So is it in the right zone district? Is the home a detached single family home? The lot coverage, so the area that can absorb rainwater. So the lot coverage would include things like driveways, homes, and so on. There's a maximum amount of the property that can be covered in that surface. And so can it meet that? Can it meet the property setback? So buildings have to be set back a certain distance from each property line. There's height requirements, parking, and so on. We're not proposing to change any of those as part of this project, though as part of the land use code overhaul that we had mentioned, that'll include a lot more community engagement. We'll consider whether or not these are appropriate for the goals of the city and the community. Just to show what some of the standards are in some areas outside of the Old Town District. A lot of the standards are identical, though there's one point that we did want to just mention, and that's the height limit. So you'd recall that the height limit for these accessory structures in Old Town is 20 feet, and that allows for that second story above a garage. In areas outside of Old Town that are more of a suburban context, that would be 16 feet. And that's what currently exists today, which would generally allow just a one-story building. And so that does help with some issues around compatibility as well. So this, we did a high-level analysis of using city data and data from the county assessor, just to look at potential areas that could be eligible for an ADU under the existing rules. This would need to be refined further. So as we are doing these listening sessions, we'll be drafting the proposed regulations. So your input is definitely being considered in real time. And so this will need to be tweaked as we get through that process. But what this shows is basically properties in Lafayette that have the right zoning, they meet the lot size, includes a single family dwelling. We can get into this later if you'd like to, but they're exempt from growth management in Lafayette, meaning they were subdivided before the mid-90s. And even with this, though, in our discussions, we think there's probably still some practical limitations to constructing an ADU in Lafayette. Specifically, those standards that we mentioned, like lot coverage and parking, might surface the expense of constructing an ADU, and so they're not exactly cheap to build. And homeowners associations may or may not choose to enact covenants that restrict or just make it hard to construct an ADU on a property within a certain neighborhood that's out of the city's hands. So when thinking about the level of community engagement when we do these types of planning processes, we think of this, we use this spectrum of public and participation that spans from informing the community of a decision to all the way to empowering. The goal of this project is to largely inform the community. And what that means is working to provide balance and objective information to assist community members in understanding the problem, the opportunities, and providing a way to plug in and provide your input throughout the process. The two big factors that resulted in this decision was that there's strong policy guidance in our comprehensive plan around accessory dwelling units and the pretty narrow approach to the project and timing of the project, in that we want to complete this by the summer for a couple of reasons, which limits our ability to have kind of multiple feedback loops that you would see in some of these more involved and lengthy processes. The last slide before we open it up for your comments and questions is just a note about the planning process. So we picked up this work again in January and started doing some research. We had some city meetings with the City Planning Commission and City Council just to review basically everything that you've just heard with them to make sure they were comfortable with the overall scope of the project. We're now having an engagement window where we're hosting numerous listening sessions. We have opportunities to do on-demand meetings with staff and provide your input and just learn more about the project. And we'd expect this summer to be presenting a recommendation to our Planning Commission, who would hold a public hearing, and recommendation to City Council, who would then hold a public hearing and ultimately consider adoption of the regulations. So I'm going to go ahead and I see that there's been some comments that I haven't. Okay, nope. So the format now is, if you'd like to provide any verbal comments, and you can always turn your video on or keep it off. That's completely up to you. But if you want to just tap the raise hand feature on the Teams app, we can get to you in order. And I see we have Noah. I'm going to be taking notes as well, and we'll be posting those notes to the project page. So take it away.
Yeah, I had a quick question about the 750 square foot maximum. Does that, so if we were to like build a garage and then the ADUs on top, is the ADU size 750 or does that include the garage? Is it the whole structure?
The ADU would be limited to 750 square feet, and the garage would as well. It's not cumulative to both, but there is a requirement that the footprint of that building be no more than 750 square feet.
Yeah, Phil, can I add a little bit of clarification? Noah, what part of the town do you live in?
I'm in Old Towns.
You're in Old Town. Okay, so yeah, it's important to know where you all live because the rules are different for Old Town than they would be for areas outside of Old Town. So I just wanted to make sure we got you that precise answer. So what Phil said was accurate in that you can build a detached accessory structure. You can build an ADU on top of that. The sum of both of those is not limited to 750 square feet, but the footprint is. And then the ADU itself, the part inside the structure that's devoted to the dwelling unit, would be limited to 750 square feet.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, guys.
So Jeff, did you come prepared with jokes or good stories while if folks are waiting to?
I did not. Are there any other questions or comments that folks have?
I actually have another question. Are the setbacks like lot specific, or do you guys know what the setbacks are in Old Town?
Yeah, I have them up here. The setbacks are based on the zoning that a property has. So in Old Town, for an accessory building or structure, from the rear property line, that setback would need to be 5 feet from the rear property line. From a local street, the front setback would be 20 feet, but for an accessory dwelling unit, that's 20 feet plus 10. So it needs to be set back an additional 10 feet. And then it would need to be set back 5 feet from the side property lines.
Hey, Noah, if you want to email us your address, because there is different zoning within Old Town, and we want to make sure that we can actually get you the best answer. So if you want to email Phil your address, we can follow that back up with this in writing as well, and point you to that information. Yeah.
Yeah, can you send your email in the Teams chat?
Yep, I just did.
Oh, perfect. Awesome.
Hi, Dan.
Hi there. Thanks for holding the meeting. I had a couple of questions. How many units do you think you're going to have initially that you would approve in the first year or two? Is there a limit?
Yeah, there'll be both a practical limit probably, and then there'll be a limit due to the city has a growth management program that does limit the number of new dwelling units, including accessory dwelling units that are allowed to be permitted throughout the years. And so we did some preliminary analysis. We were being pretty conservative, I think. I don't think the day after we adopt the regulations, there'll be a flood of permits, but we could expect probably a steady flow, maybe of 20 a year or so, as the program kind of gains speed and folks become more used to seeing them around the city. There are those practical considerations around expenses and development standards and growth management. But we would expect it to be fairly low, which would represent less than 1% of the properties totally eligible under these rules would probably move forward with an ADU over the first decade. It took 2 decades to get to 50 of them in Old Town.
Wow. So Can you explain a little more about why it would take that long?
Well, we're reading the tea leaves, so we're looking in a crystal ball, so it's hard to completely anticipate, but just the limitations that we see relating to the structure of the city's current development standards and growth management probably playing the factor in that.
Yeah, Diane, I would like to add to that. Doing ADUs is not easy outside of the city's regulations, like getting them financed, getting them designed with architecture and all that. And so I think there's a little bit of a barrier to entry inherent with doing this. But we are looking at expanding the types of ADUs to make it a little bit easier. So it might be easier to convert a basement, say, within a house than it would be to actually construct an attached or detached ADU. So that might factor into how the ADUs manifest themselves within the community itself. So it's like Phil said, it's a bit hard to predict, but we know that we have a good feeling that there's not going to be a land rush going on here to do this. But as people get more familiar with them over time, as they see them being built, as they engage with their neighbors on, oh, how did you do that? It'll probably become more frequent over time.
So I have another question. The property taxes for the single family dwelling unit, let's say, that's already there. If there was an ADU put on it, would that raise the tax? Or would there be a separate assessment for the ADU?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll give you a very broad answer because neither of us are county assessors, but your tax rate will stay the same. The assessed valuation of your property would likely go up because your property's value is increasing by the establishment of additional buildings and structures on site. One place where it might not go up is on the conversion, the interior conversion where you're not adding square footage. But I would suspect that if you're adding square footage to the home or you're constructing a detached accessory ADU, the chances are your property taxes would go up because your valuation would go up.
Okay, so I have two more questions, but I don't want to hog my time. I can let someone else jump in, or you want me to continue?
Continue on.
Okay.
It's great.
So it sounds like the ADU permit is competing with a single family new construction permit. Is that correct?
Potentially. If it's exempt, if the lot is exempt from growth management, it's not competing. And Phil mentioned there's an exemption in the growth management charter language for properties that were platted prior to May 12th, I think, of 1995, that are exempt from growth management to a certain extent. And so if you were converting or constructing an ADU on that property, you would not be competing for a growth allocation for that. If you are not in that situation and your lot was platted after 1995, it would require a growth allocation by the city to get that permit.
Okay, so just thinking from a financial standpoint for the city, most of them may or may not be, but it seems logical to me just off the top of my head that most of these ADU permits will be competing directly with new construction for single family residences or elsewhere. So those permits are going to be that are already really restricted and really hard to get for developers will be competing for this. And it seems the city is very interested in generating a lot of revenue from property tax. It would make more sense to me to use the permit for a larger home that would generate more property tax than an ADU. So since they're competing like that, it just doesn't make real sense to me.
Well, yeah, I actually, contrary to like I think your intuition, the majority of lots, residential lots within Lafayette were platted prior to 1995. So there are more of those than there are quote newer things, um, even though there's still growth occurring within the community. Um, so your point is valid. I'm not discounting that. There is a subset of lots that would be competing for the newer allocations, but it's not as many as you think it might be, given the
Well, it seems like all of Indian Peaks is after 1995.
a lot of Indian Peaks is before 1995. So, um, yeah, Phil put up a map earlier that kind of showed some of this. But you're right. I think the problem with some of Indian Peaks is maybe not be the allocation allowance. It might be the lot coverage. A lot of the newer developments are on either smaller lots, or if they're on larger lots, they have higher lot coverage than the older development, and so they might not be able to have that unless they do the conversion ADU. I will say, Diane, there is the charter election for growth management happens every 6 years, and council considers modifications to growth management on that 6-year basis. And this is one area where they might like look at more closely for ADUs when it comes to that. But ultimately, any changes to growth management have to be approved by the voters. But I do get what your point is. I'm not. You have some valid points there about there is a level of competition that probably would be engaged, and a lot of the newer neighborhoods that are currently under development already have their growth allocations. Um, the current cycle ends in 2 years at the end of 2024. And right now there's about 200 permits available for the next 2 years. And that number might increase because the development rate of the subdivisions currently under development are much slower than initially anticipated, so they'll be freeing up additional allocations as well. So I don't think, at least initially, this is going to be an issue. But if it is, we'll be able to track that data, point it out to council, and then have additional conversations with the community.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to give my time now to Noah because she's wanting to speak, and I have more questions and I don't want to hog it, so let her speak now.
Sounds good. I just had one more quick question. Do you guys have like any data on the approximate cost that people have been paying to do like a detached ADU? I know it changes year to year and things like that, but I was curious if you guys have any ideas.
We can look up the most recent permits and kind of give you an idea, but it's going to be very variable depending on the quality and the size and the materials and just the general labor market. But Phil, we can reach out to Noah we have a couple more recent examples in Old Town, Noah, that we can give you that valuation information.
Okay.
And just one other caveat is that the valuation doesn't actually necessarily equal cost, but it's a general indication of what that cost might be.
Sounds good. I'll email you guys. Thank you.
Unless no one else has their hand up, Diane, so you could. Oh, Barbara.
Hi there.
Hi.
My question is about the parking space that would need to be provided. What are the regulations around that? For instance, on a very tight court in Indian Peaks, once again, there's some very, very small, tight courts, and some houses can only fit one car, I would say, in front of their house. I know of a court where there's no space in front of the house. They literally, their house, you know, their street space is the width of their driveways. So if you say they have to have a parking space and they can park on the street, does that mean they can park in front of the neighbors? How does that work?
Yeah, so when you build a home, there's a couple of parking spaces that are required, and those are referred to as off-street parking spaces, and so they're on the property. That would be generally in the garage and in the driveway. And then the construction of an accessory dwelling unit, the current code requires one additional off-street parking space. So that would be not an on-street, but on the property. And there's certain, it has to be a certain width and so on. But I think when administering the code, we likely would be looking at things like how many cars could the driveway actually accommodate, and can it fit an extra space, and can that count as the extra required parking space. In some of those properties, it may be that under the current regulations, there's just no room for it, and that would be an instance where it wouldn't be feasible. Parking is one of the things that we see in other cities too. That's one of the limiting factors for whether or not an accessory dwelling unit is going to work, either in the cost of paving a new parking space or just not having the location for it. And so if we see it as being a big barrier, then we'll probably be taking a look at that as part of the broader code rewrite project. Yeah.
Well,
if you have a specific address, we can also do the same thing and maybe dial in a little more specific with you.
No, I'm just talking in generalities, but what I didn't understand was the last thing you said. If finding an off-street parking space becomes a problem, you may change the code to allow street parking then. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think Barbara, that's something that's on our radar for the future, not right now, but the requirement is that the space has to be provided on site. Now, if there's public parking available on a public street in front of somebody's houses, there's no law against somebody parking in there. I know that can be a point of tension for members of the community, but that would be allowed regardless of whether there's an ADU or not within these neighborhoods. So if there's a instance within your neighborhood where there is no on-street parking, either due to the size of the street or interruptions of driveways, and those cars are parked illegally, they're parked illegally. So, but if there is a parking space on the street and somebody wants to park there, there's nothing under the city laws that would prohibit that. But the zoning code requires that the parking space be provided on site.
So I've heard that the law for proximity of car to driveway is like 18 inches from the bumper to the actual beginning of the driveway. So a car can't be closer to the driveway than 18 inches, might be 12 inches, but something like that is when someone parking on a street, a public street, could have a violation.
Yeah, we can look that up. It's not an area that of the city's laws that I'm familiar with, but we can definitely look it up and see if we have that information for you.
Barbara, did you have another question?
Well, yeah, let me just ask one more, Diane. Thanks. So if you know that your neighbor may be applying for one, and at the point which on-street parking is allowed, and knowing that the space in front of your house is going to be used, can you contest their ADU?
Not if they meet the requirements for the ADU to be issued a permit. It's not something that can be contested. Like,
okay.
And I understand the question. Like, you could also have a house with a large family with multiple cars, and those are more likely to park on streets. So it's like, are we introducing a new situation with ADUs at a high level, no, we're not introducing a new situation. These things happen. But if they meet the requirements and they meet the permitting requirements, then it's just allowed or would just be allowed.
Okay,
Okay,
thank
so I have a couple questions then. Is the biggest one is water. As you know, Colorado is having some water issues and will continue to as development occurs. Are we taking into account the demand that we're placing on our water supply by like increasing the population so much? In addition, like you're saying, well, most of Lafayette is excluded from this exemption. I mean, is in the exemption. So there's no restriction on really how many you can permit in that older section. And the newer sections you can permit, and we can have more development in all of these other large parcels that are being considered.
Mhm.
Aren't we worried about water? I mean,
Yeah.
that's a big issue.
Yes, it is. And it's a complicated issue as well. And so when it comes to ADUs, you know, the amount of water that a property uses is there's a calculation that goes into that. And for the most part, what we think is that most ADUs will be able to utilize the existing water infrastructure feeding the house on the site. If an ADU would trigger an upsize requirement for that water, then they would have to pay for that upsizing in the water that goes along
That's
with
not,
that.
that has nothing to do with my question. Because that's just a penalty to the owner if they have to get a new water tap or if they have to pay for all that infrastructure. That has nothing to do with water use. When you have an ADU that has 2 more people living in it, let's say, that increases the water use. And as we increase water use in Old Town, because there's no restrictions on Old Town, the city is going to be using X number of, gallons per minute. And we're having all this new development that we're proposing. It's just, and the biggest question is Polis and his bill. I know
Yeah,
you know about that.
yeah, yeah.
So why are you all focusing on this right now when he could be doing this sweeping ADU, land grab for the whole state, or at least the Front Range? What do you think about that? The water issue is huge for his thinking, what he's thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me go back to the first part first. So on average, an ADU will be more energy or more water efficient than the irrigation that typically takes place for the lawns on that property if it's a detached structure or if it's an addition. So you're converting high water use land into lower water use land on average. And also, the water uses of big homes is somewhat different than the water use of small homes. So I'm not saying that this is a blanket hard scientific law, but on average, we know that ADUs are more water efficient than the yards that they're typically located in. They also, if they do require to have utility upcharges, there also is a dedication requirement. So we have to find water and supplement the city's water supply with that as well. So I know there's a broader answer or a broader question that you're asking about water planning in general, but I wanted to just specifically answer it for ADUs. On the Polis land use bill, City Council last night voted to oppose that legislation. And today we actually sent the City Council's a letter from the City Council to the state legislature. and we'll be doing that, engaging on a number of fronts to oppose the legislation. We think it's incredibly short-sighted, in part because of one of the reasons that you mentioned, which is the lack of control that might happen on cities' abilities to secure reliable water resources. So that's the city council's official position on this. The last question you asked is why now? Why are we doing this now? This was something that, as Phil mentioned at the beginning, was initiated several years ago. It has been a council priority for some time, and it kind of was put on the back burner because of COVID and staffing capacity. So council asked us to resurrect it again. It's something that is also identified in the comprehensive plan as a way to expand some affordability or affordable options within the community. So that's the why now question, is that we're being directed to implement that particular portion of the comprehensive plan.
So have you thought at all of, if you decide to move forward with ADUs, especially separate ADUs, of cutting down on water usage by changing what's allowed to be in yards like lawns? Have you thought about restricting lawns in the future, or making changes to current homes that have green, Kentucky bluegrass lawns?
Yeah, I know our public works department is starting to work on those efforts. They're doing a lot of long-term planning around the city's water supply. I don't know at this time where that's going to go, but I do know that it's something that's going to come up in the future to probably be addressed. Barbara,
New code as well.
Expand on that. The city actually has a fairly reliable water supply. It's when you factor in the summer irrigation that is where we're starting to run into issues, especially in the dry years. So that has to be something that the city looks at in order to maintain our water supply reliability. Absolutely.
And on private property, it is something that's on the list of things that we'll be looking at with the new development code as well. That'll take roughly a year and a half to complete, but that's certainly on the list. Diane, I know you still have your hand up, so I want to make sure.
I'm trying to lower it. I just can't figure out. So consider it lowered.
Got it. We'll stay on the line.
We have another question, but my fiance is going to ask.
Okay.
You may have answered this before about the parking spaces, but does a garage underneath an ADU, does that count as a parking space?
Yes.
We'd have to look at it, but yeah, if it's used for it would be a parking space. Yeah.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
How many parking spaces is it a 2-car garage? Is it a 3-car garage? Yeah. Depends. So yeah, but it's considered a parking space.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, guys. We'll email you.
We really appreciate.
Any more questions or feedback?
Yeah, well, we will be hosting 3 more of these, and as there's more information to share, we will be sharing it. On the Lafayette Listens page, there's also a link if you wanted to just follow up with a direct meeting. You can also just directly schedule some time with us virtually. You can reach out and we're more than happy to meet with you at the office or over a cup of coffee at any time. So want to make sure that we're available at a time that works for everyone.
And you can also leave feedback on the Lafayette Lessons page as well, or email Phil, myself, and we'll take that feedback as well.
And we'll be working too, as we present anything to our Planning Commission and City Council, to do our best to summarize what we hear today, and then anything written down would be provided as part of the record for that decision. So, not only staff, but Planning Commission and Council are very, very interested in what folks think about this.
Well, thanks for your time tonight. Appreciate it.
Yeah, we appreciate you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Should we wrap it up, Phil?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and never